All right, guys. How you doing? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Okay, welcome back to another exciting class. I wonder how your mimics are going. Um, I'm seeing some interesting ones as I go through the mirror board. All right, so this is what we're going to do today. We're going to have a kind of a interesting class. I have I think about a 1 hour meeting that is gonna fall pretty much in the middle of this class time. Let me see here now. So it's 12. Yeah, there we go. Right. So from 1 to about 1:30 thereabout. Um what we have to go through today is we do have some more tips to go through. And I also have an experience that I want to share with you guys, which is of doing a piece of work that is would be considered under the advanced visualization technique. So what we're going to do is I'm going to share that work with you. Then we're going to do some more tips. We're going to talk about link referencing. You are going to do that while I hop into the meeting, and then when I come back, we will have hopefully, which will be before we finish the other tips. I want to go through a couple of the mimics that you guys have selected, just to kind of give you some tips, some advice, specifically now for individual persons, not general. Right? So we've been doing kind of just general tips that I think would apply to most persons. It's up to you to kind of look into those explanation of those tips and determine, hey, I can use that, that layer masking thing to do this, or I can use that that skew editing technique to do this in my mimic, and so I'm hoping that you guys are just taking little notes as we go through. And then I don't know if I'll get to every person, but I will try. All right, so that is our plan for today. I'm going to demonstrate something to you, then we're going to check out some more tips that I've made for you guys, and then we'll do like a one-on-one or one-on-many. Like if I notice that 3 of you have the same looking thing, I would say, okay, those of you who have, this picture, you need to consider these things. All right, everybody clear on the plan?
Yeah.
All
Yes,
right,
sir.
cool. I'm still waiting on everybody to put their profile picture on the board as well, right? So don't forget those. This is how I inject some humanity in all of this digitalness of these online classes. All right. So
you know look like?
say again.
So you know look like already?
Well, some. Oh, okay. All right. But on the mirror board would also be good. Or I can just take a screen clip of you and just put on the mirror board.
So what kind of style that is a good style, sir. What that?
Well, I used to work with the showing the video cameras, but I realized that bandwidth is a major issue for everybody. As soon as you turn on the camera, then all the share screen and everything just start to slow down. So it's the next best thing. Profile picture over camera. Okay, so what we have here is I brought this work that I usually show in Advanced Computing 1. Let's get up the screen here. And well, it's more of a folder, right? Because it has a bunch of stuff in there, right? Bunch of files in this folder, right? And the reason there's a bunch of files, let me do a time check. Okay, right. So the reason there's a bunch of files is these files all work together to give this image here. Let me bring it up. There we go. This is the PDF image. There, let me go full screen. Right. And what this is, it's a kind of an interesting hybrid image. You know, I'm usually doing these kinds of experiments because this is, you know, advanced visualization is something that I love. So this was actually in the master's program, but the idea behind this was being able to combine the best of what construction drawings give you, the best of what 3D gives you, and also the best of what photorealistic drawing gives to you, right? And each of those give you different things, right? Photorealistic can let you feel what a space is like. It conveys a little bit more than technical data. There's a little bit of emotions wrapped up in a photorealistic image. You can make something feel warm, cozy, give me some words, romantic, you know what I mean? So these are things that you can bring out from photorealism. But the thing is, photorealism doesn't really communicate as good as drawings, things like details and how something is made, right? 2D drawings give you that ability, right? And then the fact that something is 2D sometimes, especially when it has to do with depth, you know, 3D with shades and shadows gives you that. And a section conveys a whole lot of information. So if we look at this drawing here, and this drawing actually goes on an 8-foot by 8-foot print, so it was pretty big, right? So when you pin it up, you could see all the details that your construction drawings would give you, all of the representations, and it's not exactly perfect, but you know, it communicates the block work and the you know, all of the members that come together. The computer doesn't show it as clear as when it's printed. You know, even the cladding work, how the beam works, you know, how does this gutter meet this roof? I mean, 3D doesn't really give you that amount of details, but 2D gives you that. And the concept behind this image was I wanted to get the best of all worlds. I wanted to get 3D and 2D. And, you know, the premise is kind of simple. I mean, it's really just a 3D image with a detailed 2D section kind of, you know, slapped on top of it in isometric, you know. So the concept is relatively straightforward, but the execution required some deep dive into using different programs for different things, right? So this kind of leads back to the conversation we were having the last couple weeks about, you know, if I wanted to do something like this, I couldn't just jump in like Revit to do this by itself. You know, I couldn't use Lumion alone to do this by itself, you know, and the same for AutoCAD. I couldn't use AutoCAD alone. So what happened is that we had to take pieces of it. But the idea is that we have an end result, and the end result is what matters. So I didn't have to know everything about 3ds Max. I didn't have to know everything about Revit and everything about Illustrator. I just needed to know enough. All right. So if I look here on the mirror board, I need to escape. Right, there we go. Yeah, Adobe kind of slows me down when I preview this in Adobe, so I'm going to use maybe Edge is a little quicker. I think. There we go. Yeah. Well, maybe not so quick. But anyway, if you take a look on the mirror board, over in this section here, what I have here is I have outlined my process to achieve this image that is here, right? And I've used a similar method to what we have explored, when was this, last week, right? In terms of determine the digital media functions you need, pick out the your visualization features, create an estimated workflow. Then, anything on that workflow that you don't know, do a specific research, find some tutorials, then basically create your the final work. Now, there is one somewhere in the mix. Oh, right. Here is the first one, which I might have skipped over. Select reference content. Now that is exactly what we did for assignment 1, right? Everybody selected their image to mimic. Granted, this is a little different than what you would do in actual production. So for example, when I was producing this image, I had selected some images, some reference images, but of course it did not look exactly like this. So some of the reference images that I had selected, so this was one, right? And just the ability to show certain details in section as a 3D section. This was another one here. And what I loved about this is that, I guess, well, let me throw this out as a question. Do I have time for a question? Let's throw this out as a question. You guys are on the mirror board. There are only 2 persons on the mirror board. Why does mirror board do this? Sometimes it does that. A funny thing. All right. Here's what I want you guys to do. Those of you who are on the mirror board, those who are not on the mirror board, I want you to jump on quickly. I want to see who can be the first person to identify where in my final image can they identify a reference to this image here. All right, just jump on the mirror board and tell me. You need to talk also on Zoom so I can hear you. Nobody don't find it yet? Come on. Just jump on the mirror board real quick. To jump on the mirror board, you need to go to the class website and just click on the digital whiteboard icon. Where on this image can you find the similarity to this reference that I have selected? Well, guess what? People name visiting architect, you don't have your right name, so I don't know who is pointing where. So you need to like speak up on Zoom. Hello?
Sir, do you mean like exactly like the reference picture or just using the style?
Yeah, say again, Beresford.
I was saying, sir, I don't know what you mean. Do you mean like for it to look exactly like the reference picture or just
No, not exactly. Not exactly.
that's
But where
fine.
can you pick up the inspiration that came from the reference image?
Or on the left side with
You
the
have the little blue on the floor, have the little cutout blue.
Right. And you can see it throughout the drawing. Now, in reality, I mean, when you do a mimic, you're not going to mimic every single thing. And this is kind of like an example of what the skill that I want you guys to develop through this exercise, which is, you know, your design is totally different. There might be some aspects that are similar, but your design is different from your reference image. But the essence of what you want to show is the important thing to capture. So for example, this is a steel and glass kind of building, maybe, you know, with a specific type of flooring and lighting and all of that. However, the way that it's represented was what was adapted for this image. And not just in the floor, that is pretty obvious here, but also in the makeup of certain other areas. But then you realize that it's not just about this rendering, because this has another layer of information to it. So there was actually another reference image, but I don't have it here. It was a past work of another student that did a nice 3D section, right? And that was also an inspiration as well. So, right, so heading back to my workflow here. So I determined the digital media tools that were needed. So there was obviously some raster editing, some pixel editing, and some 3D modeling, right? And then we picked out some of the major features. So, so there is photorealism, soft shadows. It's an isometric. There is vector line work. There's also some architectural custom modeling, which had to be done. And then there is a 3D section cut, a diagrammatic illustration. So for example, things like highlighting certain areas. Then there is custom modeling edits. So these were just things. So for example, like these chairs that were more like, you know, like custom modeling. So these are the things that I had identified before producing the image that I would need based on my reference images that I would need to have. So that led me down the road of saying, okay, I'm going to have to use a photorealistic renderer. So that rules out SketchUp. I'm probably going to have to use Lumion or 3D Max or something that can give me photorealism. That would take care of photorealism and soft shadows. I need to get an isometric section. Let's see. Well, I have the building in Revit, and I'm developing my drawings in Revit. So the isometric section, I could use Revit to do that. In terms of the vector line work, I know that Revit wouldn't necessarily give me all the details that I wanted. I had to supplement that with maybe adding some additional line work on top of the details. I could have done that in Revit, but at the time, I think I did that in AutoCAD. I don't remember why, but yeah. Then I also needed to do some architectural modeling, maybe. So for example, and when I say architectural modeling, I mean modeling in a BIM environment. right? Do you guys remember when you did 3D modeling and you had to create these models in Revit? You guys still remember that? Right.
Sir.
So
Yeah.
that is what I call more architectural modeling, because you're using an architectural tool to do that, right? And then notice I put architectural modeling different from custom modeling, because custom modeling would require me to use software that's a little bit more free. So for freedom, that gives me more freedom. So for example, these chairs, I mean, I could model a chair in Revit, but it was much easier to create that chair in a more free-form program like 3ds Max for me. So this is where I identify some of the major things, and then this helps me to determine a estimated workflow, which is model the building in Revit, and I'm going to try and open some of these files while I talk. Let's see. Okay, so this is the Revit file. I'm gonna see if it will open. I don't think I can open all of them at once. All right. Let me also try opening the 3D Max file. So let's do that as well. And I'm going to have to upgrade the model, because at the time I think I was using, I don't know, 2015 or something Revit. So I'm gonna upgrade the model. All right, so while that opens, so I would model the building in Revit, then I'm gonna render the building in 3ds Max, then I'm gonna overlay the image with a 2D section, and then produce the final PDF. Now, this is obviously a very simplistic workflow, and there were many adventures, I would say, that awaited me in the process of doing this, because obviously where is my mouse? There we go. For some reason, okay, there. Okay, let me open back this again. Does this work now? Yeah. So obviously this workflow here looks nothing like this workflow down here. Like, you can see that this is way more fleshed out, and this was just a quick kind of overview. So this is kind of the process that you may go through, right? Initially, when you select your mimic and you know the things that you need to do, you need to create that initial workflow, and it's usually going to be very simple, but this keeps you on track, right? Like when you get lost in, I don't know, Revit not doing something that you want it to do, or it's not looking like how you want it to look, you can refer back to this kind of early workflow to say, okay, why am I using Revit again? Oh, right, because I'm creating the building model in Revit, and I'm going to render it in Max, you know? But it is advisable that you don't just jump into a detailed workflow. For example, at the time when I determined that I know that I'm going to need, you know, things like soft shadows, and I need to cut a section and all of these things, like I know I'm going to need to do these things. It would be hard for me to like start to go in detail about the model in Revit. How am I going to model the model in Revit, and how am I going to do the little details? Am I going to model those nuts and bolts, or am I going to put it in AutoCAD? It's like you don't want to be bogged down at that early stage with those details, so you just kind of keep it high level, right? You guys understand what I mean? High level. Right? Everybody following? Has I Have I left anybody in the wind?
Sir, following so far.
Oh, sorry, follow.
All right, cool. So the initial workflow that you do is high level. You know what? I need to model the building in Revit. I'm going to render it in this program, and I'm going to merge these two things together to get the final thing. And I know that I want a PDF at the end because I'm printing this huge 8-foot thing. And because it's going to be that big, all my line work needs to be vector. So it comes out nice and neat. So then next comes the research part now, finding the relevant tutorials. And I really wish I had saved these tutorials, but I mean, at the time, like, I have no idea. I don't remember the tons of tutorials that I saved, but basically there were questions that I needed to answer from doing this. So for example, I knew I watched a bit of tutorials about how do I export, because I was planning to do the section in CAD. So when I wanted to carry the CAD drawing into Illustrator, right? I didn't want to draw any kind of architectural things in Illustrator because it's just not that kind of program. It's much easier to draw things like a wall section and hatching and all that stuff is much easier in CAD. So the plan was to draw the section in CAD and then take that section into Illustrator. Then I would render the building with Max and then take that building into Photoshop to kind of, maybe brighten certain areas or whatever. And then I put it into Illustrator. So some of the tutorials that I looked for were like little things that had to do with importing and exporting. For example, I remember that I needed to, when I carried a drawing into Illustrator, it's going to be flat, like 100% flat because it's a 2D drawing, but I need to skew it at an angle. And I didn't know how to skew an image in Illustrator. Like Photoshop, fine, I can use a skew tool, but Illustrator didn't have a skew tool. So then I had to like search, how can I skew something in Illustrator? And I eventually found it. Let's see. There was some other research that I had to also do on how do I I'm trying to remember them because it was a long time ago, so I didn't save them, right? I think it was, oh, right. So when I saved the drawing from AutoCAD, right? And this was the trick, guys. And this is very important especially in architecture school. When I saved the drawing from AutoCAD into Illustrator, I needed to have a way for it to be linked, because it is very likely that when you go to our next Descript, some things in your design will change, right? I guess, can everybody relate to that?
Yes, sir.
Exactly. So this is why it was important that the drawing that I do in AutoCAD needs to be linked to the Illustrator file, meaning that if I realize that I did a detail incorrectly and I corrected it, like, I don't want to like have to reskew and line up back that 2D drawing in Illustrator. I wanted it to just update. Then if I needed to update the Revit file, I needed the rendered file to just update. You know what I mean? So this is one of the tips that we're going to watch in about 15 minutes. While I go to the meeting, we're going to watch that tip about reference linking, the concept behind it, because it's not a one-off rule that goes for every program. It is a concept of working, and you try to apply that concept to the program you're using. That's the best way I can explain it. But especially when there are changes, you want things to be linked together in a way that they can be updated. So that was where some of the other research went into, right? All right, and then so in creating the final artwork, when I documented the process that I went through, this is what it looked like. Okay, here is the key. I'm going to try and open this. All right, let's see. Okay, Rivet is giving me all kinds of messages, probably perhaps because it's an older version. All right, so yeah, and then Max has all kinds of, because you know this was obviously an older version of Max and an older version of Rivet, so I'm getting all kinds of messages about, you know, stuff just, you know, different plugins, stuff outdated and all of that stuff. It's, you know, so I'm going to get a lot of that, but that's fine because I just want to show you guys. Wow, that's a lot of messages. Okay. So the building was modeled in Revit. The main building massing was modeled in Revit. The section was cut in Revit. But then look at this branching path here. I cut a 3D section and I also cut a 2D section, right? From the same building. So for example, when I bring up the Revit file, this was the 2D section that I had cut. Then let's see. Hopefully this is the right file, or maybe not. Oh yes, and then I had cut a 3D section as well, right? Now check this out. The 2D section has its own like development path, and the 3D section has its own development path. So it's almost like at the beginning the model went in two different directions, but they all came from the source model, which was the same. So on the 2D path, the section was cut in Revit, and then added 2D detailing to the section view in Revit. Oh, so I actually did it in Revit. I thought I did it in CAD. Actually, yes, I did still use CAD. And then I generated a 2D vector PDF from Revit, and then I linked that PDF to Illustrator. All right, well, let's take a stop right here. Let's go back up to the 3D path now, right? So I cut the 3D section, exported that 3D section as a FBX, and then I linked that FBX via the 3DX file link manager. Then I determined what objects do I need to represent in 3D and what to represent in 2D, right? So this was a very important step here, because I didn't want to be building out every single thing in 3D. Now, if you look back at let's open back the high resolution image here. See if I can zoom in. You might notice that, let's say this angle plate right here. This angle plate is in 2D, but it's also in 3D, right? But then there are some other things that are represented in 2D. For example, the covering underneath the for the drain Oh, and by the way, guys, what this is actually an a welcome center, and there was a river going through the site. I propose to have a controlled portion of the river actually run through the building, because the river was really important to the history of the site. So it's almost like inviting history into the building. And then this was kind of showing how I plan to deal with that river running through this building, right? So that's just a little bit of background on the proposal that I did here. So what this is was a kind of an overflow for the river that it collected all of the storage from the roof, and it stored it as a tank, in a tank that could be used as grey water for flushing toilets and stuff like that. And then there was another technology as well that also pulled from the river as well. But there's a control section for the river to determine how much water you want to be flowing through the building. And I mean, it's not a studio class, so I don't want to go too much into the design. I want to spend more time talking about the representation. So this was important to determine what things do you want to draw as a 2D and what things do you want to do as a 3D. Now, the reason that there is a feedback loop here, if you notice, between that and that and that, is because if I determine that, hey, this thing is too much to detail in 3D, then I would just offset it to just showing it as a 2D object instead, right? So this was kind of I guess a runoff for determining what object should be 2D versus 3D. Then now we needed to generate an isometric camera view in the 3D program, which was 3ds Max. Now this ended up being a bit more complicated than I anticipated, because as you guys know from first year, having an isometric view, you want to make sure you know the angle, and you want to ensure that it's not a perspective view, because that is going to skew the angle that your building will be at. All right. So what we're going to do now, guys, is we're going to take a commercial break right in the middle of this journey here. And we're going to look on one of the other tips that we have here, which is called reference linking. That will kind of explain the concept behind how these two branching paths work, right? Being able to link everything to the same model and link that model to your rendering program, and also link that to your 2D program as well. All right. All right. So hopefully that video won't be as long. So let's see. We are going to talk about reference linking. Okay. Okay, so the last thing we spoke about was creating a manual render pass. So now we're going to speak about link referencing. Oh, you're kidding me. I can't show this separately. Oh. Ah, there we go. Okay, guys, are you with me?
Yes, sir.
All right, hearing me loud and clear. You are alive and well. Okay, good. Okay, so we're gonna check these out now and make sure that the audio is good. All right, it's good to go. Now, another advanced tool that we use in architectural visualization has to do with masking. And masking is another one of those universal terminologies that apply to producing digital artwork, whether it is architectural work or video work or even 3D rendering work. Masking is a concept of simply using okay. That's the wrong video. We did masking already, didn't we?
Yes, sir. I think you showed that in Monday's class.
Right. We did do masking already. Um, okay, let's see here. Oh, but it is the right one. Um, it's just that sounds very familiar. All right, let's see here. Did I go through this already? Actually, no. Yeah, we did do masking, but it's in another way that we did masking. This is taking it a step further, I believe. There I did this in so many parts, so sometimes I get my wires crossed a bit. Okay.
The time is 2 p.m.
That's the wire. Oh, we are indeed on the right track. Yep, we are. Okay. All right, let's proceed. Now, another advanced tool that we use in architectural visualization has to do with masking. And masking is another one of those universal terminologies that apply to producing digital artwork, whether it is architectural work or video work or even 3D rendering work. Masking is a concept of simply using the black and white values to determine what part of an image should be hidden and what part should be seen. Now, let's say we wanted to do a particular effect here, right? So I'm going to name this layer. Let me call this layer shaded with shadows. And this shaded with shadows layer, I am going to duplicate it. And what I'll do, I'll put this in a folder and call it backup. And this is a good practice because if you're going to mess with the layers, it's a good idea to create a backup copy in case you did something to edit the image and you wanted to get back the original. Now let's say that we wanted to delete part of this image so that only the front part here would have the hidden line. Now we could use our eraser tool here, and we could let this tool be a little bigger, maybe adjust the hardness, and we could actually start erasing parts of this image here. And of course, if we save here, then we would get a prompt saying that, hey, some files have been updated. Do you want to update it? Yes. And then you would see that be adjusted here. Now this method of working is called linked reference working, where one file is linked to the other. Now let's try something else. Let us try and delete it. So I'm going to undo this. And instead of using the eraser tool, I could use my marquee tool here, and I could select a good portion of this, and I could also hit delete, and then I would get a straight edge. And the same thing again, once I hit save here, then once I return to that file in Illustrator, it will prompt me to update. Now, if it doesn't prompt you to update, you can always select the shadow. Okay, so let me say, do you want to update? Let's say no. Let's say that it didn't prompt you to update. You can always select the layer, and then on the control bar, you can select that link and choose update link, and it will do the very same thing. So now you can see that this area here is now updated. Now there's a couple things. I realized that if you look closely, you notice that this area here is white and this area here is gray. So that's why you're getting this weird box line here. Now, to fix that, let's just repair that quickly. So we're gonna go back into SketchUp, and what's happening is that we're actually seeing the section cut represented in the viewports, and we don't want to see that. So we can just actually select the section cut, and then we want to make sure that we are using the scene. So we're going to update this scene to tell this scene that when we're saving, we don't want to see this section tool. So what we're going to do is we're going to head to the styles, and then we're going to head to edit, and we're going to say we don't want to see section planes. And once we uncheck that, the section plane goes away. However, we need to update our scene information here, because our scene information is going to need to once we click it, it is going to revert back to showing our section planes. So what we need to do is click it, and we need to update it here. And there we go. We're going to update the selected style. Alright, great. So now we need to export this as a 2D graphic. And we're going to save this 2D graphic as shaded with shadows, PNG. Now if we come back to Photoshop, right, and we can undo this that we did here. When we come back into Photoshop, you realize that we are indeed seeing that section line here. So we need to basically delete this layer and replace it with the updated PNG that we just rendered. Now we're going to use a similar approach to what we did with Illustrator, where we use the reference linking work method. So that way, every time we save an image from SketchUp, our image in Photoshop will update, and then when we edit our image in Photoshop, our image in Illustrator will update. Now to do that in Photoshop, what we want to do is we want to right click this layer and say, hey, instead of giving me a layer, give me a smart layer, a smart object rather. Now once it is a smart object, we're going to right click it again, and we're going to say we want to link this smart object to a file, and the file we're going to link it to is called shaded with shadows, which of course is the PNG that we saved from SketchUp. Now these files are actually linked, so every time I replace that PNG file, the Photoshop will automatically be updated. Now of course I just updated Photoshop, so when I click save here and I head back over to Illustrator, it's going to prompt me to update this file again, and voila, the file is now updated. Now, when I head back into Photoshop, we were just talking about erasing maybe a section of the building so that we could only have this area in view. Now, if we're going to do that, we are going to be unable to use our eraser tool to erase a layer that is linked to another file. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I grab my eraser tool now and I try to erase here, it's going to give me an X which says that, hey, you can't erase a file because it needs to be rasterized before you can erase. Now this kind of leads us to the whole approach of non-destructive editing, because if we destroy these pixels, then these pixels will be no longer linked to the PNG file that we have taken from SketchUp. So we could always rasterize this layer, and that will allow us to mess with the pixels, but then it will no longer be linked to the PNG that is coming from SketchUp. We would have to replace it each time. If we want to be able to basically have our cake and eat it, then we'll have to use a form of non-destructive editing in order to be able to edit this link file without rasterizing it, essentially breaking the link. Now the answer to achieving that is going to be done using masks. And mask is a real important part of working with different render passes. It's perhaps the most important thing. Now, understanding mask just includes understanding one simple premise. Based on values that are closer to black, those values are equal to your eraser, and values that are closer to white are basically things that will not be erased. Let's look at a quick example. If I should put a background here and I should fill this background with white, then if I am unable to use my eraser on this linked layer, technically I could make a new layer on top and use a white brush, and if I paint, I will be appearing to erase the building. Now of course I'm not erasing the building, I'm simply putting white paint on top of the building, and that is evident because if I turn off that background there, you can see clearly that I've put white paint here. Now if I remove the white paint, I get back the information. So what does that mean? The information was never erased. Instead, I really just did a trick of the eyes to make it look like that the building was erased. Now, ideally, we want to still be able to erase the building, but not by using these tricks of using white paint. Masking works in a similar way. Instead, masking works by telling the computer, hey, anytime I use black paint, I want you to hide, or the word is mask, this layer. Now how do we do that? We do that by adding a mask layer. So we're going to delete these layers here, and what we're going to do is we're going to add a mask to this layer. Now to add a mask, all you need to do is to click this mask here, and whichever layer you currently have highlighted, you will notice that it gets a new layer right beside it. Now think of this layer as working just like that example I showed you. But instead of painting white paint to make it look like the model is disappearing, we're going to paint with black paint, and in turn Photoshop is going to interpret that, hey, any values that are closer to black, we're going to quote unquote erase this layer. Any values that are closer to white, we are going to, let's just say, unerase this layer. Now simply put, all we need to do is ensure that the mask layer is highlighted, and you can know that it's highlighted because you can see this square box there. Then I just need to go for my brush, and I need to ensure that I'm using black. And once I use my brush tool on this mask layer and I draw anything in black, then it would appear that I'm erasing the building. Now this is very different than using white ink, because of course you can see the checkered boxes behind, so you know that it's actually being erased. But the trick. Now, do you guys understand this concept? This is very important to understand.
Yes, sir. Following.
Right. And I know masking might be old news to some persons that have been using Photoshop in an advanced way, but it also might be new to some persons as well, right? Is this concept of masking new to anybody in this class? Give me a wave hand if it is. It is? Or do everybody in the class know about masking already?
Fairly so. I may have run into DD.
To some degree.
Yeah, DDM. Sorry.
Or well, no, we didn't do masking in DDM, did we?
I recall doing it in DDM.
Oh, we did. We cut out. But masking is different, because masking, you're actually not destroying the image. You are like hiding behind invisible paint. You know, like anybody watch Predator? No, I mean
Yes,
it's not
yes,
that,
Sir, what's it?
right.
Yes.
It's not that old anymore, because them remake it, right?
I don't watch
Right.
it.
Oh, you know what, remake it, right? But yeah, so essentially, it's just covering the layer that's there, but the actual item is still there. So this is super important for this concept that we're doing, because it doesn't destroy the content. It's non-destructive editing, so the content is still there. So that's super important, because that's how we'll do link referencing. All right, so let's continue. Is that if I should flip my colors around and say, hey, let me use white, by clicking this little arrow here, let me use white ink. Now once I draw with white ink, look what happens. It basically unerases that layer. So again, when I draw with black, it erases. When I draw with white, it brings it back. Now every time I draw with a black, instead of the layer registering that I'm painting with black, it registers as invisible, but the mask layer, if you notice here, it is actually giving us a preview of the ink, of the black ink that we're using. Now we can actually see this in full view by holding down the Alt key and clicking on that layer. And you can see here that this is what I've been doing. This is the truth revealed behind what I've actually been painting. I've actually been painting black on white, but Photoshop just says, hey, anything on this mask layer that is represented in black, we're going to make it transparent. Okay, so let me alt click again to turn off that layer. And this is exactly how we can work non-destructively, because notice that this layer is still linked to the PNG file. So if I change something in the PNG file, this will still update. So let's look at that example. So if I went back to SketchUp and I decided that, hey, I want to change the color of this material, well, I can go to the materials tab here and let's go to edit, and we can make that material maybe a little darker. Let's make it more gray, and maybe let's make it more white. Yes, let's make it completely white. Alright, then what we're going to do is export a 2D graphic again, and we're going to overwrite the shaded with shadows PNG. Let's head back to Photoshop and look at that. Instantly you see that the changes from SketchUp are reflected in Photoshop, yet it still keeps the mask that was done using the mask layer. And of course, when I save this, I go to save, when I head over to Illustrator, Illustrator will give me a prompt rather than just automatically changing as a safety feature. And then you will see that the changes are reflected. Both that horizontal erase that I did, and also the fact that I did a color change in SketchUp. And all these files are linked together and referenced. So this is a combination of working as links and references, and also working non-destructively because the files are all linked together. Now, there are some things that you can achieve by using a image editing or raster editing program, and you can't achieve with using a vector editing program, and the same is true for the inverse. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to well, let's add some effects to this here. So let's say that I wanted to cut a hole in this solid here. Well, I could go back to the SketchUp file. Now, let's say I wanted to cut a hole in this section here. Well, I could just draw a box. Let's draw a box like that. Then I'm going to use the push-pull tool, and, well, instead of pushing upward, I'm going to push this downward, because my plan is to subtract a hole there. But before I can subtract, I need to bring up the solids tool, which I'm going to open there. And here are my solids tool. Then before I can subtract these two holes, I need to group this new solid that I just created. So I'm going to select that solid, make sure that that's the only thing I have selected, and I'm going to make it into a group. So to do the subtraction, what I'm going to do is first I need to make sure that the box is highlighted here. Then I'm going to click the subtract tool here and select the bigger solid like that. And that should give me that tool just fine. Subtracting this element here. Alright, so now I need to return back to this scene. So I'm going to just double click it, and it should carry back my view exactly as how I left it, which is good. Then I am going to export a 2D graphic again, and I'm going to export that and replace the shaded with shadows. Now once that is done, I'm going to head back over to Photoshop, and there you can see that my change has just appeared. And of course, if I save it here, then that change will carry over to Illustrator. Now before I go in, alright, okay guys, so this is the whole idea of how reference linking works, right? Are you guys able to follow this concept?
Sure.
All right. Now it may it might seem a little maybe confusing at first, but it's going to be it can save you a lot of work, especially when you need to get something done, but you need to get it done in another software, and then you need to bring back that change into the current software you're using, without giving yourself double work, right? So
I was saying that do you have these videos uploaded on YouTube just in case, like while we're working, we could just reference back to them?
And the answer to that is yeah. If you right, because I remember no one thing would apply to everybody here, right? Everybody is choosing their own image to mimic, which requires your own what is this? Come on. Right, everybody is choosing their own image to mimic, which requires your own approach. So because of that, I'm expecting that you guys are going to be maybe skipping through the video to maybe remember one concept of something that applies to you specifically. So this recording will be under the class recording section, right, which you guys should be familiar with already. And then you go to Advanced Computing 1, head over to 2022-23, right? And you can see the tips part 1 is already there, and the tips part 2 that we did last time. And this will be the tips part 3 that will be posted here as well, right? Now this is super important, guys, because guess what? You know, any other tips that come from me is going to be based on what you guys show me, right? Because come next week now, you guys will be applying some of these tips in producing your mimics. You understand? So yes, the videos will be here for you to comb through. I want to just bring back some attention before we continue back to this workflow that I was speaking about. And you can kind of see the reference linking. That's the basic concept of how we link these two together. Now, if you remember, from our model, we had one set that was heading towards a 3D, and another set that was heading the 2D route. Right? So they kind of split apart and came back together. Now, looking back on this workflow now, generate an isometric camera view was where we were, right? Now, the idea was that I needed to have the perspective view match a very specific angle, right? So how we achieved that was, notice these two links here. So I determined a specific isometric angle that I wanted to use, right? And hopefully you guys remember this from first year days, right? Remember that isometric will have a particular camera view. So if I said that I wanted to work with a 45 degree, right? Then that would mean that the skew, remember that I have a 2D image coming into Illustrator, so I need to skew it 45 degrees. And then I also have an isometric in 3D, so I need to angle it at 45 degrees as well, right? So in both of these cases, this degree angle, I needed to apply it in a 3D and a 2D scenario. Now, remember, with reference linking, let's zoom out a bit. This 3D is still linked to the original model, right? And that's the important part, because even after I applied the angle, if I wanted to change something in the model, it would be a back and forth process. Or if I wanted to change something in the 2D as well, it would also be a back and forth process. Meaning that when I change the model, both 2D and 3D will change, using a similar method to what you just saw in the video just now, right? Okay, so after I selected the angle that I wanted to skew the drawing in, and I can show you this now. Oh, I do have an Illustrator file to open as well. I forgot about that. I think it's this one. Let's open it and see. All right. Then moving from that now, custom model, section detail objects in 3ds Max. So there are some objects that is much easier to add in 3ds Max than it is to create in Revit, right? So remember earlier when I was looking at the model, I was saying that, okay, there are some things, obviously a fancy chair, I'm not going to try to model a fancy chair or download a fancy chair family in Revit. Instead, I can easily grab a model from Google Warehouse or wherever and just throw it in 3ds Max, and that's how I will get my custom modeling done. So this was an application that I overlaid on top of the model that's coming from Revit. Then from 3ds Max now, then we render the final image, right? Which is here. Now, it didn't end there, because this final image now we placed into Photoshop, right? And also coming in Photoshop is that image from Illustrator, right? And what was done was that in the 3D program, it wasn't possible to render a 100% axonometric view. So I got it as close as to axonometric as I could, and then I skewed the view a bit further in Photoshop. But in order to skew the view accurately, I had to use an overlay coming from Illustrator. So I use the puppet warp tool to slightly adjust the view to match the skew that's coming from Illustrator, right? Now, here is where it gets a little tricky, because in order to get the line work to be nice and clean, we don't want to print from Photoshop. So what happened is that we carried the Photoshop file in Illustrator and then overlaid it with the Illustrator skewed file. And that basically took us to the end of the road. So there was a lot of overlaying that was happening. But the great thing about this workflow is that it was completely reference linked. So if anything changed with the model, then the 2D skewed view would change, and also the 3D would also change. And that is the important linkages that we have here, because all of these two basically came together to give the final image. So as long as we can keep this updated automatically, meaning when we change, we save and it automatically updates, then can you imagine having to realign something every single time there is a change? Having to line up back all of these things nicely, it just would not be a great time, right? So let's look at some of the technical files here. So this is a this is the skewed view that we used, and this view is also linked to the PDF that came from Revit. So when I rendered a new PDF, then this would automatically update, right? And you can see here that this has all the details, but none of this line work I can edit, because all of this line work is coming directly from Revit and linked into Illustrator. You can see that with the X here. All right. So let's continue with our tips. Now, once that is done, I'm going to head back over to Photoshop, and there you can see that my change has just appeared. And of course, if I save it here, then that change will carry over to Illustrator. Now, before I go any further, let's say that I wanted to add some effects that you would normally only get in a vector, in a raster editing or image editing program. So let's say that I wanted to add some lighting effects to show that, hey, you know, we have some, maybe put some God rays coming down from this skylight here. Now, there are a couple ways that I could do that. The first way is basically I could just draw a yellow box, which kind of represents the you know, the light kind of shining down here. So that is pretty straightforward. I could just create a new layer, and I could use my lasso tool, and maybe I would do something like that. And perhaps something like that. Then I'm going to, on this layer, I would call it God Rays. And maybe I would fill that using the fill bucket with that. Now, this doesn't look like much now, but in Photoshop we have access to a lot of filters, and one of them would be the Gaussian blur filter. So we could apply the Gaussian blur filter to this layer here. Now, if I choose to apply that filter, you can see that it kind of blurs the edges, and I should perhaps bring up this setting here, and this basically controls the amount of blur, right? So if I did it like that and choose OK, then that would be the blur that I have there. Let me deselect this, and that blur is looking kind of good. But suppose at a later time we decided that, you know what, I should have blurred it a little more. Now back to the concept, I'm going to undo this. So we're back to the original. Now what we can do if we want to use a non-destructive editing approach is, before we apply the filters, we would convert this layer into a smart object, and then go back to filters, and we can go back to blur and apply the Gaussian blur filter. Now we can set what, let's say we wanted the filter to be about that. Maybe that's too much, maybe about that. Choose OK, and what you notice is that you get this panel below the layer, and what that does for us is that if we actually double click the settings icon here, or double click the text, we have back those settings and we can adjust it even more. So this method of non-destructive editing is really useful, so we can always go back and make changes. Now keep in mind that everything we're doing here is also carried over to Illustrator. So, you know, you would have to decide what changes what kind of effects do you want to do in Photoshop versus Illustrator. If you're doing more line related editing, then you maybe want to use Illustrator, whereas if you're doing more image editing and filter effects, then we want to be using Photoshop. Now let's combine some of the things that we learned earlier. So with the God Rays, we can now use the blending modes, and we can perhaps use the overlay or the multiply blending mode. And notice what happened. This is very different than using opacity. Opacity kind of just makes everything look a bit faded, but when we use a overlay, it looks like actual light. Now, the best thing to do is to combine the two, so we can also add some opacity so it's maybe not so strong. About that. And then what would be nice is if we could kind of erase this bottom section so that as the light heads down, the bottom part gets lighter. Now remember that this layer is a smart layer, so that means that we are going to be unable to use the erase tool to erase the the light, because we don't have access to destroy those pixels because it's a smart layer. But we can use the same approach that we used a while ago using the masking technique. So again, we're going to head down the bottom, make sure that we are on the God rays layer, and then we're going to choose mask. And once we do mask, notice that I forgot to unmute. I'm going to show you where the mask button is, because you realize it was like behind my image, right?
Playing from Epic Monster.
So, well, I'm not going to open Photoshop because I have a bunch of stuff open, but it's the round, it's the icon with the little round bar. That's on the bottom. All right. Do you guys know what the mask button is?
I know.
Okay. All right. As soon as Photoshop opens, I'll just show you that so you can remember. We have a mask layer here. So this method of non-destructive, it gives us a mask layer, but it also gives us a smart filter. So all of these things are manipulating the layer with the ability to make edits later. So we're going to use the same approach, and while we're on the mask layer, we're going to use the black brush, but instead of just erasing the light, what we're going to do is we're going to decrease the hardness, and let's maybe increase the size just a bit, maybe about that, maybe a little bigger. And then we're going to decrease the flow, which is basically the transparency or how strong the brush will work. And well, that's a little too strong, so we're going to carry it all the way down to maybe 5, and there we go. Notice that we're getting that effect where it starts off bright and then it kind of ends more dull as it goes down. Now, in addition to this, we can add some other effects using Photoshop. We could use brushes. Now, the way how brushes work is you literally can just search for brushes in Google, and you are going to get a ton of brushes, a ton of hits for places that you can download brushes. Now, a brush file is a ABR file. It usually has this icon here, and once you download this file, to activate it, all you need to do is to double click it. Now, once you do that, Photoshop will open and it will just install automatically. So what is a brush? Well, a brush, I'll just create a new layer here and I'll go to my brush tool. We have been using brushes all along. And if I should look at the color of this brush here, which is a black brush, and if when I right click this, This is really just a hard brush that is, 164 pixels wide and has a hardness of 0. And when I draw with that brush, this is what it looks like. And that's because we're using a flow of 5%. So we have to like make a couple of strokes, and every stroke we make, it gets darker and darker because it keeps adding 5% each time. Alright, so let's get rid of that layer. Now, brushes can also have unique shapes, and this is where things get interesting. Now, these are all round brushes, but if we scroll all the way to the bottom, you can see where I installed the Ray of Light brushes. There's also IES brushes, there are special effect brushes. So IES brushes are pretty cool. You can get these lighting effects from IES brushes, but the ones we're going to use are going to be the rays of light. So we're going to open that up, and let's pick one of let's pick one of these that looks good. How about this one? Now, how this works is that let's put this value back up to 100, and let's pick a color that we can see. So let's use yellow. Now let's use red. Now if I click here, I will get a red dot, and if I click and hold, I'll get a red line because I'm brushing using this color using a round brush. However, if I should change the shape of my brush, so I'm going to minimize that and use one of these other brushes. Let's just pick the first one here. Now when I click, I'm going to get that, and if I click and hold, I will get, well, that. The great thing about brushes is that if we choose the appropriate brush, so let's say that we choose, maybe this brush here, this one. Let's adjust the size a little bit. It's a bit too small. There we go. We can also affect the rotation of the brush, and we can also change the color of the brush. So let's choose yellow, and let's call this God Ray Light. And if I click once, you can see that we get this really bright, well, in this case, maybe we should use white. So let's try using the white. It's not bad. But this is on its own layer, so we can actually use the multiply or the overlay and just kind of mix this together. Maybe turn down the opacity very low. And then I'll probably want to turn down the opacity of the card ray layer as well. So we get this interesting mix like that. Now I'm going to save this file, and of course before I take a look on the Illustrator side, I think I want to bring back some more of the building here. So I could go for my brush, make sure that I'm using a white color now, and make sure that I'm on the mask layer for the building. Then I want to use a round brush, preferably pretty small. And of course, alright, I want to be using a white brush. And I can bring back some more. Now, additionally, I could remove some. So I'm going to continue to remove some like that. Like that. There we go. And I'm just using the eraser here, but I could use my marquee tool and then fill this with black paint. That would also work, because essentially I'm just filling this area with black like that. Alright, so we're going to save this image here. Now Illustrator also has the ability to do masking as well, and the concept is the same, but the way that it achieves it is a little different. So for example, if I am in Illustrator and I'll just go to a new page, a new artboard, and if I have an object in Illustrator, let's say that I have this box, and let's say that I fill this box with a gradient, maybe a orange gradient. There we go. Now, if I look in my layers tab, which we find here, you will notice that you can see that layer there. However, in Illustrator, we have, think of it as like objects that are on a layer. So if I expand this down, you will see that, well, this layer only has one object, and that object is called a rectangle. Now, masking in Illustrator is done by putting an object above. So for example, if I should get a, let's choose a circle. And let's say I draw a circle like that. And let's say that I make this circle, well, we can just make this circle a simple black and white image. Now, in Illustrator, I can use this circle as a mask to say, hey, anywhere this circle intersects this box, I want to keep those areas and throw away everything else. So what does that mean? Well, I could select my circle here. I could select the box here and notice that the circle is on top of the box. Then I would just right click and say make clipping mask. Then what do you notice happens? This circle, wherever the circle intersects the box, is kept. Now the awesome thing about Illustrator is that this is all non-destructive. So if you look at the layer here, you will see that it has a clip group, and if I expand that group, it still has the circle and the rectangle. So that means that I can actually go back to the rectangle and I can actually move it around. So you can actually see where the circle is masking the rectangle, and I can still edit them just the same. I can edit the rectangle, and I can also tick on the circle, which is doing the masking, and I can even go in and adjust these values, and it will still mask the square, the rectangle rather. Now this is really awesome, and this provides a whole new way of masking that Photoshop doesn't possess. So if I head back to my hidden line here. Right, so let me turn off the shaded with shadow. That's the layer that's coming from Photoshop. Now let's say that I wanted to let's say I wanted to like remove all of this here without actually deleting the lines at exactly this point. Instead of slicing all of these lines, what I could do is just mask this entire object, where I would say that, hey, I want to draw a box here, and everything that is inside this box I want to keep, and everything outside the box I want to throw away. So let's look at a way we can use this advanced technique to do some interesting things. So, well, first thing, which is always a good practice, I am going to group the vector paths, because this vector path is filled up of a lot of line. Like, there are individual line work. I could actually move this line here that makes up the entire drawing. So what I'm going to do is select that entire layer, and I'm just going to create a group. So that makes it just easier to select, because when I select something, it will select the entire group. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer, and I'm going to call this the backup copy. Call this backup. Always a good idea to back up your layers in case you might need it later. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my pen tool, and I'm going to turn on the shaded with shadow layer, and I'm going to use my pen tool to kind of just follow this edge here and go all the way here. There we go. And I'm going to just fix that up with my direct selection tool. So I'm going to just adjust that line there, and that one seems fine. Now the idea, let me turn off the shaded with shadow. The idea is that I want to tell Illustrator that everything inside this shape I want to keep, and everything else I want to throw out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this object and select this layer and say make clipping mask, and then that's it. I have now masked this, but notice that these lines are still very much active. If I hover over it, you'll see that these lines are still there. So if I turn on back this layer, you see that only that is remaining. So we can do some interesting things here. So if I wanted to remove that mask, well, I can select it if I just hover over the line. There it is. Or I can use my layers tab and just say select clipping path, and then I can right click and choose, or rather I can go to object, I can go to clipping mask and say release, and now it's back. Now what I want to do here is I'm going to copy this clipping mask again, and notice that when I deselect it disappears, and that's because it has no line color. So I'm going to give it a black line color so that I can see it, and I'm going to do the same for this clipping mask as well. I'm going to give it a black line color. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach these two together. I'm going to use my indirect selection tool and just kind of attach that there. and attach that like that. All right, now the plan is I'm going to tell this to be clipped by this. Oh, not group, sorry, I mean make clipping mask. Then I'm going to grab my backup layer that I saved before and duplicate it, and then I'm going to say, hey, I want this to clip this area here. Now when I do that, it's going to give me an error, and the reason that it does that is the thing that you want to clip needs to be on top of the element that you're clipping. So in this case, I want this path to be on top of this group. So I'm going to move it like that. And now when I click this and that, and then I'm going to right click and say make clipping mask. So I have this back part here as one mask, and I know it is because I can turn it off. And I have this front part here, that's another mask. Now what I can do is that this front mask here, I can double click to go into that to be able to edit that group, or I can just select from the layer and select group here, and that's going to select the front mask. And now what I want to do is I want to change all of these lines. So I go to stroke and let's change them to a dash line. Now you can kind of see the dash line going on there, so I would say let's make the gaps a bit bigger. So let's try 5 maybe. Or let's try 20. And that's what we get with 20 there. That's interesting. Let's kind of zoom out, see what that looks like. Alright, now you see what we're getting here is that on one of the masks, where the front mask, it is set to a dash line. Now it's really the entire mask, but the entire group, but because we mask only the front, so only the front shows. Now additionally, we could also change the color of that stroke. So under color swatches, let us load let's load art and illustration library, and let's choose maybe a orange color. There we go. And then we can turn on back that background layer. There we go. Okay, so now that we have that complete, you can see where these two layers are still fully aligned, and that's because they are coming from the same model, and that model is also fully aligned by ensuring that the SketchUp view is saved. Now, an important thing to note is that this concept can be used with any software. For example, if you use a program like Revit, because Revit can generate a particular look or technique, as long as you save the appropriate view, you can manually create your own render passes and use the different effects of each software to achieve various visual techniques. Now, just some additional little pointers. If I wanted to maybe add a kind of sky in an artistic way, so let's say for example I wanted to maybe add a partial background, maybe I add a sky to maybe just this part of the image. I wouldn't want to necessarily do that in Photoshop, or I could do it in Photoshop and import that cut image in, but it would be much easier to cut out that sky using Illustrator, right? So for example, if I grab a sky and drag that in to Illustrator, could put that on a new layer and call it sky, and I'll put that layer at the bottom. Then what I'll do is lock the other layers there so I am unable to select it. Now if I decide to use Illustrator to maybe add in an interesting sky background, the challenge will be that, well, you won't be able to modify this image. So for example, if I wanted to make the sky bluer or edit the maybe this is too dark and I want it to get brighter, Illustrator would not be the place to do that. So even though I can add the background in Illustrator and it's maybe quicker, I would probably want to add this background from Photoshop and then place it in my Illustrator scene. Now, one way I could do that is I could maybe place the background like this, and then I could just mask the background. So for example, I could use a rectangle tool and just draw on top of that like that, and select the sky, right click and choose make clipping mask. So now I have masked out the image. Now if I wanted to edit this image though, and I started in Illustrator, then what I could do is, well, I could access the layer, access like that, and then I could embed that image. And when I embed the image, it's no longer linked to the original source of the image. Then what I would do is unembed that image. And what that will allow me to do is Illustrator will allow me to save. So I'm going to call this sky, and it will allow me to save it as a PSD file, and then it will automatically link that PSD file. So now if I go to edit original, it's actually going to open that PSD file in Photoshop. And let's say that I wanted to maybe edit this image? Well, I could use my adjustments to change things like the brightness or the hue, but instead of using these adjustments, these are more destructive, which means that once you edit these pixels, you can't change them. The better thing to do would be to use adjustment layers. And to get to your adjustment layers, you need to enable it, which is here, adjustment. And there it is. So that's the adjustment layer. And what the adjustment layer does, it gives you all of these options here. And you can basically choose any one of these options and it will adjust this layer, but in a non-destructive way. So let's say I want to use brightness and contrast. Well, when I click that, notice that the layer gets this adjustment layer on top. And when I edit this layer, it will actually edit the adjustment layer, which adjusts the layer below. Now, if I turn off the adjustment layer, notice that I get back my original image. So this way of editing an image is much more efficient than destructively manipulating the image, and it can't be edited again. Now, just like before, what I'll do is that when I edit that and I save it, when I return to Illustrator, that image is now updated. Alright guys, so how was that? Are you still alive? Are you still here? Are you still awake?
Sir.
It was what? How was that? Awful? It was awful?
No, it was a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot. Well, welcome to Advanced Visual Techniques. I mean, the sky is the limit. There is, and this is why I chose to show you in this way. If I just tell you, okay, this button does that and that button does this, in the advanced way of doing things, it would be very confusing. So I showed you in the process of creating something architectural. So I'm not saying it's not a tutorial where you would, as I keep saying, to follow and create the same thing, but there are certain aspects of it that you can apply to certain things. So for example, if I go back to the mirror board here, let's kind of zoom out a little bit. So, all right, this is an easy one. So, Andre, you here? No, it don't look so. Okay, all right. Well, for those who have maybe a section like this, can you guys see how some of the things that we discussed today could apply to this?
Yes, sir.
All right. And let's pick another one here. I have an advanced floor plan tip. It's very short. I don't know if we can get to it, but that's pretty easy to achieve. Okay, even in some of these, but my next video would address some of the more photorealistic ones, right? A lot of you have ones with light. Can I find any with light? No, not really. There was a few. Okay, yes. So for example, you want to represent these lights. So brushes in Photoshop could get you this very easily. Maybe you can even do the line work in Photoshop. I need to go through a little bit of these. Some of you have images that are photorealistic, like this one, semi-photorealistic. Oh, this one is so interesting. I like the way how it kind of mixes and it has some texture with it as well. And then everything else is kind of blocky, but then it has shadows that are generated. There are some soft shadows in here. That's why it looks a little bit semi-photoreal, right? This is not just, how you put it now, this is not just SketchUp shadows. These shadows are photorealistically generated. So I want to go, a lot of you have work that have line overlays in it, and that's just something that is just true in architecture. We deal with the business of line work, right? So knowing how to manipulate line work is something that, if you want to have no limits with how you visualize, you need to know to manipulate line work, right? Most of the tutorial is just like showing you one way in which you can manipulate line work. Like, even look at this. I mean, there are not that one. Where is it? Even images like this, there's a lot of line work in there, and you know, if you're trying to achieve most of this line work in like AutoCAD, or even if you use Revit, you're just not going to have the flexibility to express all the things you need to express in an architectural program. So what's going to happen is that you have to now generate this thing in the architectural program and then take it into a program where you can freely express, you know, color and shade and light and all of those things. So, you know, when you're representing these advanced images, it's hardly that you just do everything in one program, right? Like an image like this, I would go from maybe Revit, maybe SketchUp with a axonometric view. Then I would tweak the hidden line to what I want, but I would definitely carry the line work into Illustrator and then maybe use the live paint tool to kind of fill these areas out. Or maybe I can just draw a big box underneath the drawing that's blue. That's one way that it can be done. Most of these people here are silhouette people that can be added. I have just 3 more short tips to show you. I know it's kind of a little bit of an overload, but guess what? This is the only week that you guys can absorb this thing, because after this, it's your turn to show me, right? I show you first, then you show me. It's only fair, right? I don't hear anybody agree. It's only fair, right?
Yes, sir.
The way you say yes, it sounds like a question. All right. Now I see that there is a lot less persons in the class. So is it that we're overlapping with another class?
Could be the case, so I'm not sure.
Possibly.
Possibly. Okay. All right. Um. All right. Now there is. We do have some more points to get through. I think you guys should have enough information now. Okay, no. Let me show maybe one more for those because you're going to be doing the floor plans. So, and then and then next week we can look on some more. This one is short, I promise you. All right, let's look at this one. Perhaps one of the most popular uses of Illustrator for architectural visualizations would be in the use for creating floor plans.
So you're not on the video.
Oh, I'm Oh, yes, I am. Oh, I'm not? Yeah, I
You've
am.
seen your Illustrator screen.
Yes, that is the
Okay. Alright, you're on it. Okay.
Sir, no audio, don't say.
Know what?
Audio.
Oh, let me go. Perhaps one of the most popular uses of Illustrator for architectural visualizations would be in the use for creating floor plans. Now, Illustrator will open DWG files natively. So if I choose to open, let's say, the presentation, the 2D floor plans, you will notice that the DWG files will come up with a message saying, should we fit this to the artboard? And we're going to say yes. And there we have it. Now, right away, this should be familiar ground for anybody working in architecture. As a matter of fact, maybe we might be tempted to maybe use a architectural program to do presentation plans. But the truth is that there are a few tools for working on presentation plans that you usually will find very useful. So the first thing is, well, we're going to use just one as an example. So I'm going to get rid of these plans here. And then I'm going to select this plan and place in the middle of my drawing. Now, working like this in Illustrator is pretty similar to traditional ways of working on architectural plans. Everything is individual lines, and we can set line weights and color for each individual line that's here. So usually one would want to maybe start to clean up the drawing first, get rid of things that we don't necessarily need, and maybe you can start to put things on different layers. For example, I may want to put all of this furniture on one layer. So I would create a new layer here and call this furniture. And I would just right click and say send to current layer. And I can always just turn that off. Now, the next thing that we probably will do with floor plans is try to normalize the multiple line weights that we see. So perhaps the easiest way to do that is to just select everything and just say, hey, just let this be one stroke thickness. So let's try 0.5. There we go. Now, another tool that is perhaps underrated in SketchUp is in Illustrator is the Live Paint Bucket tool. And what this does, you can find it as a sub tool under the gradient tool. In my version of Illustrator, I have taken that out and have it separately. This is what it looks like. Now the idea for this is that you first want to select all your objects and then click the Live Paint Bucket, and when you hover over any line you will get this red message that says click to make a live paint group. Now once this is a live paint group, we are able to, let's say for example, we let's go to earth tones, and we want to start filling these walls with different colors. So we could actually start doing that by just using the Live Paint Bucket and filling these walls here. So it works just like any typical paint bucket, but the difference is that it works with vector lines. So it's based on the line work, so it's a lot cleaner. Now, another interesting tool that we could use is start to combine some of the things that we learned earlier. So, for example, when it comes to putting texture down on a floor plan, we could use the mask tool to have it shape in the shape of the different rooms. So for example, if I should go to some textures, and let's look at a carpet texture here, or a floor plan texture here, we could take this directly into Illustrator. But we're going to use some of the approaches that we have previously learned. Perhaps in knowing that we might have to change the tile color or adjust the tile, we could perhaps take this into Photoshop first. And while it's in Photoshop, let's convert it to a layer. And just in case we need to change the color, we could add an adjustment layer here with hue saturation. And what that allows us to do is to use the hue to browse between the colors. So maybe we want tile that might be closer to a more light pink color. There we go. And then we would save this as a PSD file, and we could call it typical tiles light yellow, since it's very light. Now back on the side of Illustrator, we can now place these tiles, and this is using the same concept we did for the section views, right? So here we go, and then we're going to place these tiles. Now we're going to resize it. And then of course you will notice that we would need to cut it out to fit. So first thing we'll do is probably put that on a layer. So we will send it to a layer and maybe call it tiles. And then let's put that layer behind. Then what we could do is, well, first let's turn on the floor plan layer and let's lock it. So that way we don't accidentally move any lines. And let's call this floor plan. And what we're going to do is we're going to go on the tiles layer and we're going to use our pen tool to basically trace along these walls. Now the trick is that I had to lock the layer below if I intended to use it as a trace layer. If I didn't lock it, then I would be editing the layer that's below this, which is a bad thing. Alright, great. Now it's there. Let's take a look on that. And we're going to use the layer mask by selecting the tile, and we're going to choose make clipping mask there. So right away we're able to cut this to fit there. Now any kind of special texturing that I might need for any surface, I would do that texturing in Photoshop and then link the changes over. So for example, any kind of particular effects that I needed to have happen in Illustrator, since I'm dealing with a floor plan, maybe I would prefer to stick in Illustrator and then do all my editing work in Photoshop. So for example, if I don't know, if I wanted to like have some of my tiles missing, let's say that I have this dirt map that's here, and I'm going to pull that dirt map in, and let's say that I wanted to maybe have like a few tiles that are missing and probably have dirt below them. Then I would readjust this right here. I would perhaps use a blend mode. So there we go. And right away you can see how I can get some texture by blending. Or if I didn't want it to have that effect, I could use maybe like a multiply or a overlay. Let's use the multiply. And then what would be cool is let us use some blending options here, and let's drop a inner shadow on this layer. So when the blending options come up, we could go to drop shadow, and actually we don't want a drop shadow, we want an inner shadow. And let's increase the opacity, probably increase the noise, increase the distance a little bit. There we go. And let's adjust the choke slightly. Maybe not so much. Let's adjust the size and the opacity so it's a little dark. There we go. And I guess this looks like a couple tiles are missing, and then we will just save this out. And of course, when we go to Illustrator, those changes would be reflected there. So the idea is that any texturing that I want to do, I am going to do that from Photoshop. And most of the line work that I want to do, I probably would do that from Illustrator. Now, another, I would say, important tool that is good to be used in Illustrator, especially for floor plans. And for this time around, I'm going to lock my tile layer and unlock my floor plan layer. And that is here, which is the appearance panel, right? And I'm going to undock it so we can see exactly what it does. And the appearance panel essentially allows us to layer effects on top of each other. So let's say I select the walls here and maybe I want to add an effect. And one of those effects could be, how about a drop shadow? So we would go to stylize and then go to drop shadow. And you can already see where the shadows are showing there, and we can adjust the offset. We can adjust the blur size. And the great thing about that is that actually remains there, so I can go back to edit that shadow at any time, or I can add additional effects. So for example, I could add an outline to this wall that's already outlined. So if I go to new outline, and let's say that I chose to add a black outline. How about, let's just pick a red outline just for kicks. And for this outline, I'm going to go into my stroke options here, and we're going to offset it, and we're going to make it right. Now another interesting thing is, for example, we could add let's add a offset effect. So we're going to go to path, and then we go to offset path. And we're going to set the offset to 10 points. And we will get a kind of confusing look when we try with the offset, but we can turn it off. Ensure that you select the object first, and we can turn it on and off all the effects that we would want to have. So it's a really awesome thing that we're able to layer different effects together. So let's give this a try with a separate shape. So let's say that I have a new shape here, and I think I better put that on a new floor plan. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a drop shadow to this. So I'm going to go to effects, stylize, and add a drop shadow. So there we go, and we can see that the drop shadow is there and it's working just fine. Now we could add another effect here. So let's add another stroke. So I'm going to click stroke there, and this time we're going to make this stroke a different color, maybe like blue. And we're going to change the sizes. So this first stroke that's here, we're going to make that thicker, and this second stroke that's here, so you can see one stroke inside the other. Now we could add a drop shadow to the first stroke. So with the first stroke selected, to go stylize and add drop shadow. And I'm gonna say OK. And we're going to need this to be a little bigger so that we can kind of see the effects a little better. So there we go. So right now we have two drop shadows on top of each other. So let's reduce that there. Let's put that to 0.5 and maybe 0.5. And then we're going to make the bottom stroke a bit bigger. There we go. And the top stroke, we're going to make that a little bigger. And the drop shadow for the top stroke, let's see if we can make that a little blurry. There we go. And let's make that bottom stroke a little bigger. So you can kind of see what's happening there. We have a bottom stroke, then we have a shadow, then we have a top stroke. So with this kind of options, we can do all sorts of things. So for example, for the top stroke, we could add another effect. So we could go here and we could add a scribble effect. But the scribble effect wouldn't work on stroke, so let's remove that there. We could change the stroke type of the top stroke from uniform to a particular shape. So we can see where the stroke starts little and then it gets big and then it gets little again. And the good thing about all of these is that these effects are actually layered, so you can turn them on and off, and you can also save these as a layer style. Now to do that, we need to access the graphic styles. And this is what this tab looks like. And how the graphic styles work is that you just need to select the object of a style that you just created and choose new style. And that's it. Now, any other object or line work. So for example, if I am just doing an ordinary line, I can just click this graphic style and then it will automatically update to that graphic style that I created over there. So things like drop shadows and those things, we can save it to our graphic style so that we can apply it again on another object. Especially for floor plans, there are a lot of options to achieve varying effects with floor plan walls using the appearance panel, so that you don't have to manually create it, but instead what you just do is create a style and then you can just add this style to a different object. So if this was the style of the wall that I created, now I can easily apply this style to any shape that I draw by just going to layer styles and clicking that. Now additionally with layer styles, so let's say that I was creating a particular type of wall. I could go into my appearance panel for this wall, and maybe in path I can add an offset path, and what that does is let me choose how much I want to offset a path. So let's say I offset a path like this, and let me duplicate that. Well, let me duplicate this path here and then offset this duplicated path in the opposite direction like that. So now I have an interesting style here with a wall style. I have two double lines here, so I can just add this as a graphic style, and then if I wanted to use this wall style somewhere else, let me delete that. So for example, if I let's lock the floor plan layer, and if I wanted to draw a wall that is here, I could just draw that and then apply this wall style. And well, in this case it definitely needs to be a bit smaller, but with this wall style I can just adjust the color and everything for it in the appearance panel that's here. Now another tip for doing floor plans is in terms of the use of furniture. Now typically I believe most representation of furniture can be had by just getting a decent enough PNG file with transparency and just dragging that file onto your floor plan. But another tip that I would encourage is for the use of 3D programs. So for example, here in Twinmotion has a host of various types of plans. So there we go. If I needed to get particular furniture and objects, I could just search the massive library that Twinmotion has. Then I could just take a top-down view of this library. And when I take the top-down view, there we go. I just adjust the lighting so I get a nice kind of view there. And all I need to do is to save out these images. Now, Twinmotion isn't going to give me images with a transparent background, so I'm going to get it with a white background. So in this case here, I can easily drag this table right here. Now, in most cases, it may work. Let's put this on a layer on top. And once we put this layer here, we're going to bring up the transparency window here, and all we have to do is use the darken layer overlay. And what that would do for us is just give us a nice representation for the furniture directly from a 3D program. In some cases, some of us might have to take this into Photoshop to edit it, but as you can see, this came directly from Twinmotion, right? You just need to render it on a white background with some soft shadows. So for example, let me just take another example here of a bed. There we go. And let's also put that on the same layer. We're gonna make that smaller. Way smaller. And we'll do the same thing again. We'll go to here and we'll go to darken. And in some cases it does work, but in others not so well. Like in this case, the darken layer overlay causes the floorboards to show on top. And when we go to multiply, it kind of does the same thing. You can kind of see the same thing happening there. So basically in this color mode, whatever is white, so you can see the white on the paper is showing through, but the brown doesn't show through, so it works. So this shortcut method may not work all the time, but ultimately you can take your images into Photoshop and remove the background, and that way you can get some nice 3D looking models from virtually any 3D application that you choose. Alright guys, so that's a whole bunch of tips, maybe too much, but I will leave you to dive through them to find the one that applies to you, right?
Yes.
All right. It's okay. It's almost 3. Okay, so where I leave you with is just some tips on where we are so far that's specific to your particular floor plan, right? I'm gonna just try and pick out some that I identified. Here we go. So for example, in this case, well, I actually did an example one time of how I got soft shadows to show like this, right? You can try to paint it directly from Photoshop, but that is usually no fun. Once there is soft shadows, you're going to want a program to try and generate it for you, right? So if I was doing this plan and I wanted to get some soft shadows here, I would I could use the drop shadow, and then I could kind of customize it a little bit. So for example, let me close some of these things. All right, right before I close it, this was the Rivet file that I was opening to show you guys. So let me close that. And this was that Max file. This is what it looked like coming from 3ds Max. And this was the section that I took from, this was coming, actually this section was taken in Max, because Max can cut sections which is pretty cool. But it's not going to be accurate like an architectural section. But anyway, let me also close this file. I'll have the files so I can open them again another time. Right, I just wanted to kind of, there's a lot of plans here that have soft shadow or soft shadowing on them, right? Let me open this image here. Right. So
The time is 4 p.m.
let's say that I have a wall like this, and I'm just going to fill it with black paint. All right. So maybe this wall came from, I don't know, a PDF or something. But ultimately, when you have a wall and you need to add a drop shadow, this is in Photoshop. You can, well, first what I would do is I would try to work with smart layers as much as possible, if you remember that from the videos, because with smart objects you can edit after you confirm your manipulation. So for example, if I convert this to a smart object and then right click and go to blending options, let's give that some time to come up. There we go. And then I can go to drop shadow. There we go. It's probably one of the easiest ways to add drop shadow. Can change the size, can also change the distance, and you can change the opacity. Let's make the size a little bigger. And then you have a simple shadow. Now, if you want to get more custom with the shadows, hold on. When you add it as a smart object, you can always go back and edit those shadows again, right? So there's a shadow, I can turn it on and off. If I realize that, oh, I didn't want the shadow to be a particular way, I can just double click it and those blending options will come up again. There we go. And then I can, edit these shadows again. Maybe I didn't want it to be so transparent. Maybe I wanted to change the color of it. There we go. And so forth. So when it's a smart object, you can go back and edit it. All right, so I'm going to remove, where are you? Clear styles, right. Now, another way, if you want to be a little bit more custom with it, you can duplicate that layer and you can add a filter effect. Now, this layer that I duplicated, I'm gonna call it shadow, just so we don't get it mixed up. So I'm gonna call it shadow. So I have one wall that is my original wall, and I have one wall that I call this wall that I call the shadow. And then what I'm going to do is to add a blur to it, preferably maybe a let's add a motion blur. Don't think we're going to really see it because it's black. But you can kind of see just a little bit. Nah, the motion blur is not going to work. Let's try the Gaussian blur. I think that's a bit better. And we're going to increase that to be quite blurry, like about that. Now the good thing is that this is a smart object. So as I said before, I can go back, and if it's not blurry enough, I can make it more blurry or less blurry, right? Now, I'm going to put this kind of side by side so you can kind of see it. So that kind of takes care a little bit of the blurriness, but then you need some directionality to it. Now, as much as possible, you want to try and keep it as a smart object, so you don't really want to explode it or turn it into a flat object just yet, a rasterized object. So I would now add I will try adding a mask so that I can do some basic masking, and maybe let's use my brush tool here. Let's make it a little bigger. Yeah. Then I can leave the hardness as is. There we go. And maybe a little bit like that. Then most of the time these shadows, they're a little bit more blacker at the base, so that original wall layer that I had, I would use the shadow, the drop shadow on it. Come on. Oh, it's going in the wrong direction. My bad. There we go. Let's make that spread a little bit bigger. Let's make that like that. Let's the size a little bit bigger so that those two items blend in nicely. And let's choose OK. Now the great thing about both of these is that they are both smart objects, so you can kind of see where you can get some direction to them using a combination of the shadows. So you can have like these shadows here that kind of looks like that. All right, guys, what do you think? Can pass?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, we can pass.
All right, let's look at some other techniques here. There's a lot of plans that have shadows, so hopefully you can re-engineer some of those. I won't touch this one because this was kind of covered in the videos. There's so much interesting ones. I won't touch the super simple ones because I'm sure that you'll be able to manage those. Yeah, that is Kira can manage that, man, right? Kira, is Kira here? No. Oh, this is almost the same, just inverted with color, and I guess you guys know how to invert colors already, so I won't waste any time on those. A lot of these are having a play on soft shadows. This is kind of similar, but the difference with this one is that notice that you have shadows going like this. in a certain direction. You could attempt to draw the shadows manually, but I wouldn't really recommend it. I mean, you would still get the job done, I guess, but it would be quite kind of tedious for you to do that. Plus, when you're doing these things, you want to try and use the link referencing approach, right? So if you can get a change without you having to do over major work, then you should really go for that. So I would try to get these shadows from a different program altogether. So for example, if I went into SketchUp, come on, and our time is about up now, so I'm just gonna leave you with some tips as I go. So if I went into SketchUp and let's say that there is maybe there's a door here, and then maybe there's like a window here. Push that out. Then the great news with SketchUp is that SketchUp automatically gives you nice shadows already. There you go. So going from a top view, you already will get those shadows. So I'm going to go with top and parallel projection. Here we go. Now the thing is, you're not going to get the shadows as vector. So if you try to export as a PDF, you're not going to get these shadows. So your best bet is to export as a PNG. I don't remember if you get the shadows as PNG. Let's see. Come on. All right. I'll just go to the desktop here and I'll call this shadow test. I hope my thing is set to transparent. All right. Then head back over to Photoshop. Well, let's keep it left and right. And then we can open that image. There we go. And check it out. We have some shadows and they're all transparent as well. Now it's not 100% perfect because obviously the shadows need to be semi-transparent, but there's a lot that you can do with this. So for example, if you had a I'm going to just create a new layer and I'm going to just fill that with a gradient of what now? How about we just grab a sample of this? So that's like pinkish, kind of light pinkish, I think it is. Maybe like that. I hope that works. Anyway, yeah, there we go. Something like that. Let's make it a little bit, yeah. Let's put that on the background, right? So, yeah, obviously this needs to be semi-transparent, but the good news is that you can layer that together. So, for example, you could have your wall, and I would probably do the wall in what's it called, in Illustrator, but just for the sake of time, if I had done the wall here, then this would be my wall layer and this would be my shadow, and I could add a mask and then I could use my brush and let's make that soft brush, and let's increase the size a little bit. So maybe that's a bit much, so you probably need to decrease the flow a little bit so that it's not so heavy. Oops. There we go. There we go. Right. So then, you know, and then the good thing about this is that you would add a transform to it. So, well, this doesn't really have texture, so you're not really going to see it. But if I had like a textured background, like sorry guys, I'm kind of shooting from the hip here, so I'm kind of just making this part up as I go. So I'm just grabbing assets as I can get to them. All right. Let's see. What does that look like? Maybe some kind of maybe carpet-like material. Just to show this example. Yeah. It's probably not a good example, but it can demonstrate what I'm trying to show here. Right. So notice that you get the texture coming through, and then you can further multiply that by using a color overlay. So for example, you can get your shadows really bringing up those textures. Let's put the wall on top of that. There we go. So you end up with something like that, and then you can add a little blur to it and all of that stuff. All right. All right. What do you guys think? You understand that concept?
Somewhat, sir, somewhat.
Well, I shall leave you to experiment. There are many more there. Eager to see what you guys come up with. We are way beyond our class time, but I think you've gotten more than enough content to work with. So by next week, remember the first two you're going to do is the floor plan and the section. So as I leave you now, I leave you with all of these recordings and resources, and I leave you to experiment to figure out how you're going to combine different methods to get some of these things. All right. So, all right. So that is pretty much it for our very long class. But it has been a week of those tips, and more tips. You're supposed to be all tipped out by now. All right. Well, I'm going to leave you now, guys. So I'll see you guys next week. Let me see, is there anything else? No, pretty much anything else that we need to do. Remember, when you're going to have this stuff on your mirror board, so you're just going to do a simple share screen. You're going to send me the link to the mirror board so that I'm able to zoom in and go and check it out for myself. Remember that you should have your workflow, just the final workflow. Not you don't have to give me the initial one, just the one that ended up working. And please remember, you only need to do one floor plan. All right, you have a 3-story building, you have 3 plans. Please don't do all 3. You only need to do one. All right.
Yes, sir. Noted.
All right. I know I still gonna come and I'm going to see people doing all 3 floors, and I just gonna tell them, boy, you just did a whole lot of work for nothing. So remember that and pass that.
Sir, that I cause my star, you know, sir, and I have the time to do it. That's all I'm doing.
Say that part again.
Sir, that's because they are stars and they have the time to do it, so they do
Oh,
it.
I get you. All right. So I'll see you guys around as soon as it's finished encoding. I'll let it available to you ASAP so that you can start to do your research on your first 2 minutes. Take care.
All right, sir. That's all.